Good morning, boys and girls. Welcome back. Last week we finished up in the book of Daniel, and this week we're going to pick up in the book of Esther. So in looking at chronology in the Bible, because if you went in the book order, Esther comes first and Daniel comes later. But chronologically, time order, Esther comes after. So some of the Jews have returned back to their homeland, but some are still living in Persia. And that is where Esther is. She is still in Persia, so a foreign land, not her homeland. So just to kind of update you where we are. So we're picking up in Esther, chapter 1. We're going to cover chapter 1 and most of chapter 2, hopefully, or at least half of it this morning. Make Peter a little nervous here when I say a chapter and a half. So we actually start off in the palace with King Ahasuerus. We don't even pick up with Esther right away. We have King Ahasuerus, and the queen is Vashti. And where we start off sounds like a grand time. The king has been throwing a party for 180 days. That's a school year, boys and girls. We go to school about 180 days. So he's been throwing this party, having a grand time. It finishes, and he's like, hey, let's have another party. He decides to, that's right, eat lots of food and bamboo, huh? He decides to throw another party for 7 more days, which it says in Esther chapter 1, verse 5. And when these days were expired, the king made a feast unto all the people that were present in Shushan the palace, both unto great and small, 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. So he has his big 180-day party, then he throws one for those who live in the palace for another 7 days. At this time, Queen Vashti is also throwing a party for all the women in the palace. So you've got 2 parties going on at the same time. That's right, Peter, you get to go to one and I get to go to another. So they're throwing these parties, they're having a grand time, and the king has had a little bit too much to drink, and he's excited to, I know he shouldn't have, he's excited to show off everything that he has, all the riches, all the wealth. And while he's showing all this off, he's like, hey, I have one more thing to show you. I have the most beautiful queen. And he wants to show off Queen Vashti. So he sends some of his servants to go get Queen Vashti. And when they get to Queen Vashti, verse 12, but the Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore was the king very wroth, and his anger burned in him. So they come to get Vashti, and Vashti refuses to go with those people. She knows the king has been partying and thinks this is not a good idea, I shouldn't go. Well, the king gets super angry. So he asks his wise men, he's like, what do I do? The queen has said no to me. What do I do when she says no? Thanks, Peter. He doesn't push her. But the wise men are like, well, if you let her get away with this, all of the wives in the kingdom are going to think they can get away with it. And all of a sudden, all the wives are going to tell their husbands no. And this is going to be very bad. So they paint this really ugly picture, not literally, figuratively, of what's going to happen if the king does not handle this situation, if he does not take care of it. So they say you need to basically tell the queen she can't be queen anymore, and give her estate away, the land, the property, the possessions she has, and give those away. Well, verse 21, and the saying pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. And he, verse 22, for he sent letters into all the king's provinces, into every province according to the writing thereof, and to every people after their language, that every man should bear rule in his own house, and that it should be published according to the language of every people. So, boys and girls, we know back in Genesis that God put the man as the head of the house, and the wife is a support, is a helper. Now, this king does not know God, and that's not necessarily the basis in which he's coming from. But he sends out a decree, says that Queen Vashti has been punished. This is not acceptable. She needs, wives are to submit to their husbands. So Chapter 2, then, we finally get to see where Esther's going to come in. Not quite at the beginning, but we're going to get to Esther. In verses 1 through 4, the king's servants basically, Ahasuerus is kind of like, what did I do? I got rid of my queen. Now I need a queen. What am I going to do? So he's talking to his wise men. Verses 1 through 4, they kind of come up with a plan. They're like, well, why don't we gather all the pretty virgins in the area, bring them to the palace, and then essentially have a beauty pageant with them. And you can pick who you want to be your wife, who will be the next queen. So verse 5 says, now in Shushan, the palace, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity which had been carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. So when the men get carried away a long time ago, Mordecai's family was part of that group that had been carried away into Babylon. So he is one of those who had been in captivity. Verses 7 and 8 bring in Esther. It mentions a girl named Hadassah, whose mother and father have died. Well, that's actually Esther. She's an orphan, and Mordecai is her cousin. And Mordecai decides that he will raise Esther and teach her the things of God and the ways of the Jewish people. In verse 8, it says, so it came to pass when the king's commandment and his decree was heard, and when many maidens were gathered together unto Shushan the palace to the custody of Haggai, that Esther was brought also unto the king's house to the custody of Haggai, keeper of the women. So Esther is chosen. Esther is one of the ladies who is picked to go to be before the king. And it actually says that Esther is favored in verse 9. And then one more point we have to make, boys and girls, before we wrap up today, that's going to come up through several different stories. In verse 10, Esther had not showed her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it. So Mordecai tells her, don't tell anyone that you are Jewish. Don't tell them. And Esther obeys. Vashti didn't, Esther does. Esther obeys. And then we see in verse 11, and Mordecai walked every day before the court of the women's house to know how Esther did and what should become of her. Mordecai took his responsibility very seriously, that he was to take care of Esther. So we see Esther's example of obedience, and we see Mordecai's example of responsibility. And throughout our study of the book of Esther, we're going to kind of keep seeing that, seeing those traits in both of those characters. As you go throughout your week, boys and girls, do your best to be obedient like Esther was obedient, and do your best to be responsible like Mordecai was responsible. See you next week.